Kia ora koutou katoa. Hi from New Zealand and g'day from Australia. I'm delighted to be here for the third day of Virtually Cochrane, an online event hosted by Cochrane UK and Cochrane Ireland. I'm Catherine Marshall. I'm based here in New Zealand, and we've given you a session from down under. We've got Hilda Bastian, who's going to be talking to us soon from Australia. So we're delighted with this event. We chose this theme, Virtually Cochrane, and navigating evidence and uncertainty, due to the situation over the last year, a year that's been uncertain, unlike anything we've known before. While dealing with uncertainty around health, working situations, travel, and so on, we've had to navigate an infodemic, being faced with a huge amount of information, some of it accurate and some of it quite dodgy. To make sense of this tide of information, there's been a great deal of work undertaken by Cochrane, along with many others, involved in planning, doing, sharing, and using health and healthcare evidence. For those of you who have just joined today, welcome. To all of the previous sessions for Virtually Cochrane have been recorded and are available to watch on the platform at any time. There's also an introductory video if you'd like to know more about how the platform operates. Today's session is systematic evidence and the COVID-19 stress test, pass or fail. And this really links to the whole theme of navigating evidence and uncertainty. One of the things that has happened in the last year is there's been a real interest in science. And you would have thought it could have been systematic evidence's shining hour. And yet we've seen it called things like evidence-based medicine's nemesis. And people are arguing the approach, which is now, is evidence-based healthcare obsolete? Does it need redefining? So we've had huge conversations and discussions, whether it's been about masks, school closures, whether we should have living systematic reviews on the run. What are the things that we should be concentrating on if we're going to be providing reliable evidence to people who need it now? It's my great pleasure to introduce Hilda Bastian to provide us with her insights into some of these issues. I've known Hilda for about 25 years, and so it is a great pleasure to have her here. She's going to be speaking as a meta-scientist, a writer and a cartoonist, who's in her recent doctoral dissertation focused on ways of shifting evidence and how it affects the reliability of systematic reviews. Hilda blogs at Absolutely Maybe, at PLOS, and contributes to Wired, BMJ blogs, and the Drugs and Therapeutics Bulletin. Hilda, when I first met her, was a long-time consumer advocate, and she was one of the first Cochrane consumer people and helped build Cochrane's consumer capacity, and I think it's a fantastic foundation. That was something like 10 years ago. Hilda was also the first coordinating editor of Cochrane Consumer and Communications Review Group. Hilda has been the chair of the Consumers Health Forum in Australia. She's worked at Germany's IQWiC and the US National Library of Medicine. Hilda leads an independent advisory group and a pilot on stakeholder engagement for controversial Cochrane reviews. As I said earlier, Hilda lives in Australia and is working on a biography of Austin Bradford Hill. I hope, like many of you, or many of you like me at least, follow Hilda's blogs and her tweets. She also has a really great website, which I look at regularly, hildabastian.net. And if you haven't already logged onto that, I'm sure after today's presentation you will. What we're going to be doing today is inviting Hilda to talk in a few minutes. Then we will have an opportunity to look at your questions and to have a conversation. We've got a good amount of time to talk together, and I hope that we can have a really good discussion. So as with the sessions yesterday, please submit questions for the panel members using the Q&A function available on the right hand of the screen. If you find a particular question or comment relevant, please vote on it by clicking with the thumbs up. And we'd like to address as many of the questions as we can, and we'll start with the most voted questions. So now that I've explained all of the technical detail, I'd like to get down to the opportunity that we've all been looking forward to and hearing from Hilda. Over to you, Hilda.
Thanks, Catherine. G'day, everybody. It's the end of our day here, so we're all sitting in the pitch black, but it's the start for everybody else. So I'd like to start by doing some disclosures first. So Catherine already mentioned that I'm involved with sorry about this, just give me 2 seconds. Okay, I'm right now. Catherine mentioned that I was involved with the Cochrane advisory group on controversial reviews, but I've also been criticising some prominent systematic reviewers recently, and I'm not going to talk about any individual people and really don't want to. The other relevant disclosure here is that I was a member of the grade working group when the summary of findings table was developed, and you'll see why that's relevant later. There's been a lot of criticism about evidence-based medicine, and I'm not going to talk as much about the specifics of what happens inside a medical consultation. I know that those things about communicating with people have actually already been discussed a fair bit in the talk so far. But I actually want to get into this, the underlying issue about how people got really quite concerned about evidence-based medicine per se, in part because of what some positions that some very prominent people in our community took, and perceived failures in the evidence. So I really wanted to look at that and see what did I think were some of the things that we needed to learn out of it. And I started to think of it in terms of it being a stress test. And people have said that a lot about COVID-19 overall, that this was a stress test for societies, that we started to see where there was strengths and weaknesses and so on in healthcare systems and in a whole range of things. And I think that that's true. And many things that we thought were really strong turned out to be weak, and other things that we thought maybe might be weak turned out to be stronger. A lot of the things that are the weak links that we found were not necessarily surprises, but we just sometimes realised, you know what, we've got really some quite burning issues here, and it kind of helps, I think, bring some things into perspective. So that's really what I've gone about here. I'll inevitably talk a bit more about the weaknesses, because I think that's often where you learn things from. In some ways, I think that there are three very separate issues here. One of those is around the evidence and systematic reviews. One of those is around the skills and methods of critical appraisal and doing systematic reviews and trying to keep on top of shifting and growing evidence. And then there's that issue of those high-profile people that upset people so much and made a lot of people question, the value of this movement and the whole underlying emphasis on evidence and so on. And I think it's actually helpful to separate those out, because those are actually three very different things with very different strengths and weaknesses. But I've still got them chained together on this slide, because I think that one of the things that I'm going to really highlight as one of the main weaknesses that I think has really been underscored by all of this is actually of relevance to all three. One of the ways that I think it's really quite important to think about this, so you'll see that pop up a few times in my slides as I go through, is to think of before, during and after. And that is that systematic evidence and all of the issues that I'll talk about actually had something to, we had a starting base, and one of the first things that a lot of us did, including policymakers and all sorts of people, when these events began, was to go, well, what have we learned in the past? What do we know? And obviously, systematic evidence would have been a really important starting point. So knowing what the state of that was, and how much it helped or didn't help, is really quite important issue here. The second was, how did we accumulate evidence and how did we keep on top of it during? So the before, if you like, is the issues that are related to pandemics and so on. During is specifically COVID-19. What did we learn, and how did things help or not during that? But I think the issue of after is incredibly important, because that's why I've done this in a circle, because the after of this pandemic is the before situation that everybody's going to be in for the next one. And that might be sooner than we'd like it to be. And I think that that's actually really quite important. I'm going to go through, sorry, let me go. I'll sort this out in a minute. When I get on top of this, I'll, I don't know why. Oh, I see. Sorry, I've lost connection to the clicker. Just give me 2 seconds. Right, it's weird. It'll be worth getting the slides. Just,
I know it well because I've seen the slides and they're cool. I think we.
Could you see the slides?
I can only see disclosures at the moment.
Yeah, the clicker's not working.
Yeah,
I can't work out why. Sorry, it'll only take me a minute. I've got a plan B for the clicker. I'll try.
Hey, Hilda, it's David here in tech support, so I can help you if you like.
Oh, it seems to be working again.
Yeah, okay.
Beautiful.
Super.
Thank you. Excellent. Sorry, people. Okay, so now you should be seeing the chain that I was talking about and the strong and the weak links. I hope. Are you? No, it's jumping around. I don't know what it's doing.
So Hilda,
okay, now you should see before and after. I think we're right now. Okay. Are we? Yes. So the first example that I want to talk about is convalescent plasma. And I'll say a few things about this, because they're really quite. They end up having a lot of issues in common with several of the other issues that we had, and I'm going to pick a few examples and go through them quite quickly, I hope. I'm going to talk about the systematic reviews, and you're not going to be able to see where they're from, but I've created a list of links which you'll see later in the question and answer box if you actually want to go up and look at any of these. So the before situation, when we came into this, there was a systematic review that had been done in 2015, and it was about severe respiratory infections using the donated blood of people who had recovered from the condition as a treatment for the condition. And it had had a search done in 2013 and said there were no randomized controlled trials. And their conclusion was that convalescent plasma may have a clinically relevant impact. And so that set off that conclusion that this could have a beneficial effect, set off a really quite large kind of stampede, really, to using convalescent plasma. Now, it was the key basis of the case for using this therapy in this pandemic that was used by the proponents. I mean, that systematic review was a really big player in this. In August 2020, the US Food and Drug Administration cited it as a key part of the evidence for why they were saying they gave it an emergency use authorization. But There was another systematic review that was done in July of last year. Now, you may not know about the systematic review. It's not cited in the Cochrane review, and it didn't really get that much attention. And the fact that this didn't get much attention is, I think, already like one of the first lessons that we've got here about the effort that people go to search for systematic reviews, which ones rise to the surface, and whether we actually look at the best evidence and the best systematic reviews to start with. Now, this one wasn't obscure. It wasn't in an obscure journal. It wasn't by obscure authors. So, for example, one of them was Gordon Guyatt from the Grade Group, and an active Cochrane person that people will know. At that point, they said that there had been 4 RCTs in influenza using convalescent plasma, 2 of which were done by the US National Institutes of Health. In that intervening time, that previous systematic review was out of date. And they concluded that the evidence now said there was no convincing evidence, and the likely scenario was that it could have minimal or no impact on COVID-19. But that simply really didn't get all that much attention. So what happened during? Cochrane started a living systematic review, and it's a really, really good one. I found it extraordinarily helpful. It was all the things to some extent that you'd want a systematic review to be, or an awful lot of them. And there was a version in May, then there was an update in July, then there was an update in October. And their conclusion was that it was uncertain. This is only looking at the evidence about COVID-19. It was uncertain whether this was actually a beneficial treatment, which would come as no surprise to you if you'd read the other review that had been done in July. Now, one of the things about this, though, that's a problem is that it hasn't been updated since then. And one of the things that happened is that we got what I call Incredible Hulk result, which is a trial so big that it basically smashes everything else, and all other evidence is just dwarfed by it. So at that point, the evidence is really whatever the Incredible Hulk says it is. And it really doesn't matter all that much what else there is. And the recovery trial has been that for COVID-19. I mean, an absolutely awesome trial done out of the NHS that the entire healthcare system and the researchers and patients with COVID-19 in the UK just, had this enormous gift to the world of this particular trial. But what it means is, of course, that the Cochrane Review was instantly wildly out of date in January 2021, but it's still sitting there as is. This is really the phenomenon that you get with, what have I done? With these Incredible Hulk trials. This is a cartoon that I did about it. The jerk that's always throwing his weight around in COVID-19 is the recovery trial. Put that in, and the evidence is immediately basically adds up to whatever the recovery trial said it was. Now, here's a systematic review from February. By this point, there were 10 RCTs, and the one at the bottom, they've divided them up into reviews that were published in journals, reviews that are only in preprints, and then the Hulk at the bottom at that point was just a press release, so that's why it's separate. But essentially, the evidence comes down to, in a great big, strong, in a really, really quite strong way, to the same conclusion that the before systematic review would tell us that we should expect, that there wasn't really any benefit. Now, this is a really interesting situation that we're here. The image that I'm showing you here is the outcome of all-cause mortality. And one of the real issues that we've got with that is that we went through all of this just to find out something that we could have already known if we had insisted on a systematic review of the before information that was more up to date than one that had had a search strategy in 2013, which is the one everybody relied on. Now, that was predictably going to go badly, but it raises for me a range of issues that I think that we really need to think through, and that is, if that evidence, including 2 quite recent trials from the National Institutes of Health, could be so easily ignored and forgotten, could this happen? Could this happen again? You know, could we lose the message of all of this effort that we've gone to get an answer? What's going to happen after? What's going to happen in the next before? Now, the real proponents of this treatment, even though the treatment is getting used a lot less than it was a few months ago, they haven't actually been daunted at all by the lack of evidence from the trials. And in fact, here's this comes from a paper that a preprint that they've just that the leading proponents of this have just released, which says that they start to talk about convalescent plasma hesitancy, and that people being convinced by these trials has cost a lot of lives. Now, there's a couple of issues here with this. One is that they say they have no competing interests, despite the fact that they were such leading proponents of this intervention. They've shifted to other arguments, as often happens with these kinds of situations. And so they're things like, well, we needed to have particularly higher quality convalescent plasma. We needed to start using it earlier, those kind of questions. So there's going to be a lot of questions that are still alive about this issue that we really need to get resolved. But when you do a search now in Epistemonicus, the systematic review database, I found around 60 systematic reviews now of convalescent plasma and COVID-19. And that kind of is a really interesting thing to think about. What is before next time going to look like? And there are several issues that I think are really quite critical, and I'll come back to them a bit more later. One is what happens when you've just got this absolute cacophony of competing systematic reviews, and how do you actually get to some kind of a level of a consensus from enough leading influential places like organisations, like societies of healthcare practitioners and so on, to future-proof you for next time when people go to the evidence and see what's there and try and come to an opinion based on it for the next time. How to ensure that we actually have a really good answer and don't just abandon all these living systematic reviews without having created that time capsule that's going to help our future selves. That's going to be a really critical pass or fail moment, I think, for systematic evidence, how well we do that. The other is the issue of non-financial conflicts of interest in systematic reviewing. And that's one of those issues that I think is going to be really come up when we talk about the issues around high-profile proponents and so on of systematic reviewing. That is a recurring issue as well. And then the obvious one about the incredible Hulk trials when you have systematic reviews in emergencies. I mean, instantly when one of these incredible Hulk results come, all the systematic reviews are really out of date, and you're actually better off just looking at that one trial result than you are looking at systematic reviews. But we really need to have quite a lot of clarity about what the policy is going to be about updating once a major trial like that comes up. So that's the first. So that's my first one, right? The next one, I'm sorry, I'm having so much trouble with this clicker. I will get there. Right. The next example starts off with the whole Incredible Hulk issue as well, and that's hydroxychloroquine. The result for that, and I think everybody's already discussed this and is really quite familiar with the whole kind of disaster around the promotion and use of hydroxychloroquine and the opportunity cost of doing that throughout this pandemic, and that sort of wild goose chase of putting all that effort into that particular therapy instead of ones that actually worked was really quite a critical phenomenon here. So for time to think about that, June 2020 was when the recovery trial press release came out for that treatment. Now, what my problem is, I'm not waiting for the time lag. I should confuse you less from here on. Okay, so I just want to make one particular point to add to the points that I'm layering up here around systematic evidence and how we deal with how this particular episode has highlighted problems. There was a living systematic review and network meta-analysis of drug treatments for COVID-19 in the BMJ. And one of the things that they did, they published just after, a few weeks after the recovery trial had published, but they published it without the recovery trial. So they went ahead and published as though the recovery trial hadn't happened. And one of the things that happened with that was they had this summary of findings table with this visual this whole visual color coding system that you see in the first little image here. So that's that was a system that they had where they said the most beneficial treatments are going to be coloured green for any particular outcome. And because of the nature of the way they put it together, even though the evidence for hydroxychloroquine was always weak and it really it didn't work, there was an outcome that it was basically the only trial that measured it. And that was one of their pre-specified outcomes that they had for the summary of findings table. But there was only a very, very amount of weak evidence for that outcome. The recovery trial and most of the other big ones didn't actually measure it. So no matter what you did afterwards, it looked as though hydroxychloroquine, when you looked at their picture and you cared about this particular outcome, which was time to symptom resolution, you would get the impression that the most beneficial treatment was hydroxychloroquine, if that was the outcome that you wanted to achieve. Now, that was clearly extremely misleading. And one of the things that happened when that systematic review came out was that the people who were really, really mad keen proponents of hydroxychloroquine could point to this and say, look, here's this systematic review, which is the highest form of evidence, and it says the most beneficial way to resolve symptoms is to use hydroxychloroquine. Which is clearly problematic. I mean, we had a bit of a debate over that, and they changed it, but the change actually was an improvement, but it still didn't resolve the problem. And I think that highlights two things that are really quite important for us to consider. We make really quite a lot place quite a lot of importance on pre-specified rules and keeping to them. But sometimes they can produce very, very harmful messages, and particularly to people who are either don't really understand the system of the way that you're communicating and the subtleties behind how something like that could come to be. That somebody would say, the best treatment for this outcome is hydroxychloroquine. But there are times where actually sticking to your pre-specified rules is going to be the wrong thing to do. And it really was here, I'd argue. And the other issue is the importance of how you visualise and how you summarise the evidence. I think that we've put, even though it gets talked about a fair bit. Certainly, the issue of plain language summaries, for example, has been talked about a lot at this meeting. The reality is that we actually don't put anything like the methodological effort and the research into this particular part of our methodologies that we do to issues like statistical bias and statistical methods. And that is actually a really serious problem. When we get into debates around things like the summary of findings table, we come up against these kind of arguments that, oh, look, we have research that shows that that the way we're doing it is a good way to do it. But it's actually very, very limited body of evidence, and in not particularly representative people, and people who quite possibly understand too much about the systematic reviews that are being summarised and the data that's being visualised. And I think that this whole episode and the way some of this information has been fastened onto and misused really highlights that this is a problem. Okay, then we get on to masks, where angels fear to tread. So back in April, we're in the before times for systematic reviews and masks. At that point, we actually already had some quite new systematic reviews, but it was still all before, evidence from before COVID-19. I found 7 of them at that point and was having a look at them, and I came to a few conclusions about this. One of those was that you would end up with what I believe to be really quite misleading results if you didn't analyse use by infected people of masks to try and reduce transmission. And to really look at what was happening in the contacts of people. So, masks are used in different ways for different purposes, and if you don't actually really, if the reviews didn't really have a lot of clarity about that and divide things up in that way, they could come to very misleading conclusions. The second one was, for this particular body of evidence, if you only looked at RCTs, you were going to miss the pandemic-related evidence. So you were going to miss the studies that had been done around SARS-1 and so on. And if you only included RCTs, you came to a different conclusion than if you didn't. And that was actually really quite problematic, because arguably the best evidence for the way that we wanted to use masks wasn't in RCTs. So that decision had a really major impact on whatever your conclusions would be. And the third was that you really had to have, you really did need to use some indirect evidence and some mechanistic evidence. There's a level where some of these questions were never really going to be able to be answered well by randomised trials, and for a whole range of reasons. And you really needed to have a look at a range of evidence and come to a kind of a rounded conclusion about it, or you were going to come to really problematic conclusions. Now, the issue then with that was where was the Cochrane review in relation to that? There'd been a Cochrane review that included this question for a really long time. There was a version in 2007, a version in 2010, a version in 2011, and then it got updated in 2020 in the middle of the pandemic. So in 2010, it concluded that simple mask wearing was highly effective. In 2011, it said transmission barriers, of which masks were one, were effective, and masks were the most consistent and comprehensive of the support measures. But then in 2020, the conclusion changed, and the conclusion became there is uncertainty about the effects of face masks. And that's a classic example of the issues that I had just highlighted about what happens if you concentrate only on RCTs, if you don't consider the issues separately about reducing the risk of infecting contacts and so on, and if you don't look at at a range of evidence of other types. This is actually a really, really difficult situation for a range of reasons. I've got a cartoon that deals with one of those issues, which is the issue about concluding that because you don't have evidence from RCTs, that somehow you've proved something doesn't work. And throwing that kind of a conclusion into a highly controversial issue where you've got highly politicized arguments about pro and against masks, the evidence then became something that people use to say masks don't work because there's no evidence that they work, and therefore somehow they don't work, and we shouldn't use them. This is leads to a point that I think is a really quite critical one for us all to sort of start to consider around evidence. That systematic reviewing, we treat them as though systematic reviews is just an absolute public good, and it's a good thing to do. And COVID-19 has really underscored to me that's actually a really problematic way, not only for us to think about it, but also for us to talk about it to other people. Because we're in that situation where people will just cite something as a systematic review and say it outweighs everything else because systematic reviews are the best and most important evidence, even when it's a glaringly wrong systematic review or it's a really flawed systematic review. Years ago at ICWIG, we did some work looking at systematic reviews that came to conflicting conclusions. And one of the issues that emerged out of that for the group of us that were looking at it was that once you had multiple systematic reviews, almost by definition, you had conflicting ones. And it became really quite clear that often people were doing systematic reviews because they disagreed with another systematic review, or because they were actually trying to get a message that they wanted to have out there, just to create this extra strength to it. It's like, I've done this trial, or I've got this opinion, but people aren't going to believe me, so I'll do a systematic review, and that's going to strengthen my arm. And so one of the things that happens is that systematic reviews are actually, if there's a spectrum, if systematic reviews are this kind of like ultimate kind of, on occasions, sort of road to wisdom at one end, at the other end, they can be absolutely weaponized. And that's actually a really quite important thing to keep in mind when we just sort of tell people all the time a systematic review is the way to go, and that's the thing you should be paying attention to. Sometimes, no, you shouldn't be paying attention to that systematic review. It's going to actually lead you astray. So those are some of the things that I wanted to say about the actual evidence. And then I'll move on to that other part of this sort of way that I'm carving this up a bit, which is the skills and methods. I think the skills and methods did really, really well in this pandemic, and that's, you could see that in the by the systematic reviews that were really, really good and had helped people enormously, but in a whole range of other ways as well. And this gets me onto the example of vaccines. Early on, I decided that I was going to really concentrate on vaccines very, very early, already by whatever that was, March or something or other like that, more than a year ago. It was really clear that there were going to be a lot of people developing vaccines. It was clear from the work that had been done in the past on other coronaviruses, on MERS and on the first SARS, that actually made it really, even though there'd never been a proven effective vaccine for a coronavirus, it seemed to me that it was highly likely there was going to be, but it was going to be a very, very chaotic situation and a very difficult one to keep up with. And indeed, it absolutely turned out to be that way. But one of the things that I found with that is that we have a lot of faith in people in our communities' ability to use those skills and methods, and that they will use those skills and methods. But this issue, amongst perhaps all issues, I mean, I think perhaps even more than masks in a lot of ways, really showed how bias can run absolutely amok. And I don't mean now statistical bias or any of those kinds. I mean personal bias, cognitive biases, the personal opinions of people and what they want it to be. I mean, for the vaccines that we even saw a lot of people in our communities, nationalism even, actually trump their critical appraisal abilities about the quality of trials, which has been a really quite stunning sight for me to see, the extent to which people will just overlook any kind of problem in an evidence base, even when they're experts. It's a thing that I've seen before. Obviously, we've all seen it, but it was so stark this time that it leads to one of the reasons that I think we really need to think about this a lot. Now, before all of this happened, I was a really major proponent of people not duplicating efforts and coordinating and not having wasted time of huge numbers of people updating the same thing, doing the same searches over and over and over again. And yet when this came about, I ended up doing exactly all of those things that I'd always argued against. I ended up doing a ton of searching. I've been searching every single day. I can't not. The particular methodology that I've got for keeping up with what's happening around vaccines means I have to do it absolutely every single day, or I'd be really in trouble. I don't think I've missed a day in over a year. And that's a colossal amount of duplication when you think how many other people are also creating databases. I've got here an image of the database that I made public that I keep up to date each day. But at different points when people would get in touch with me and say, oh, look, we're now developing this database about vaccines and those kinds of things. We'd really like to work with you, or, can you have a look at our database and tell us if we're missing anything, those sorts of things. I very, very quickly realised that much as I would love to be able to not spend that much time doing all of this searching every single day, I realised that I absolutely had to. And when I was thinking through why that was, despite my beliefs, I realised that there were a few issues. The duplication was bad. That was absolutely problematic. But it was so problematic that a lot of people were using these different databases, and the amount of coordination that was necessary for them to all be of equal quality just wasn't happening. So I'll give you an example. Early on, it's got a little bit better over time, but early on, there was this enormous bias against any vaccine that wasn't European or American in those databases. But there was another problem. They would say trials. Somebody would register a trial that they would describe as that was a phase 2/phase 3 trial, and people would classify it as saying this vaccine is in phase 3 trial, when it wasn't. It was in phase 2 of what would eventually become a phase 3 trial, but at the time it wasn't a phase 3 trial. So you'd get all of these issues like that were just not being resolved in a range of these places. So a lot of people were going to databases of very, very unequal quality, and that's a problem. You ended up seeing, it was responsible for that differing information basis that experts as well as interested other people had, was responsible for a lot of the misinformation that was out there. Almost any time I see anything about COVID vaccines, I'm sort of gnashing teeth about something, they say, and there's been no trials in children, for example, was one that was going around for a long time, just because people were ignoring the vaccines that were in fact doing trials in children, those kinds of issues. But for me, it really became quite critical to continue to do it despite the duplication, in part because the time lag was so great in so many of these databases. And when you're in that kind of a real-time situation, as people would have discussed a lot already, speed is really important. But the other one was the evidence-based medicine community's silos. And by that I mean saying we're going to gather we're going to divide these things up this way. We're going to say here's the randomized trials, here's this study type, here's that study type, and that wasn't actually the thing that you needed to be on top of this information. What you needed was information that was not around study type, but that was actually around each individual vaccine, so that you could see, for this vaccine, here's the preclinical studies, here's the trial registry reports, here's the results that they've put on the website of that company, here's what the different regulatory agencies are saying about it, those kinds of things. And that wasn't the way that people were organising their databases. They were organising them around these other kinds of silos. Now, I think that there's been an enormous amount of really valuable coordination about those silos, though. That's going to be incredibly critical in the after phase of this. But we really need them to be very hard to overlook, and we need them to be really explicitly prepared as time capsules and figure out how to do that. I mean, we're going to be I think probably in a place at the end of this that we're all just going to want to just move on as fast as we can and forget that this thing ever existed, in the same way as you can read an awful lot about the in the early years after the giant flu epidemics after World War I, and not even realise that there had even been a flu epidemic, because absolutely nobody was talking about it suddenly. And that's actually a real risk, because if we walk away and don't tidy this up, just because we're sick to death of the questions like, do lockdowns work, do masks work, whatever, we're just not going to have done the job that we really, really need to do. And all of these kind of simmering issues of that people are being so biased about, they'll just come back, just as virulent as whatever the next virus is, the next time this happens. This wants to stay on this cartoon, which I understand. I quite like that cartoon, but let's try and move it on. Oh, it's gone to... What happened? Okay, sorry. Right, so now we'll go on to that issue of the high-profile proponents. Now, this particular cartoon that I've got turns out to be really quite out of date. In many ways, it was exactly the situation that we got into. Things got awfully tense for the town folk townsfolk when the next meta-analyst rode into town. I mean, we have had people with competing systematic reviews on different subjects just at war with each other. But the reason that it's out of date is that you see the two bystanders there. They're just kind of like curious about this, about this kind of high noon situation that's going on. Turns out that's actually not what happens. People take sides, and people are enormously barricaded. They're in teams on these things, and absolutely everybody is in and fighting with each other about these things. And underlying all of that is this issue that I think that we just really don't. Really have never really come to grips with properly, which is that that massive level of bias around systematic reviews. We act because we say they're such a good thing, and then people are sort of idealistic about it. We lose track of this point that Arthur Miller made in his autobiography many years ago. He said, "There's nothing as visionary or as blinding as moral indignation." And that's one of the things we often attracted to people and take the sides of people who are very, very passionate about an issue, and we admire it. But the reality is that is actually can be a really quite dangerous phenomenon. And there's another thing, and that is that the skills of evidence-based medicine and the skills of systematic reviewing, if you're really, really good at it, you can actually use them for manipulation. It's an ability to really take down the evidence that you disagree with and highlight the evidence that you agree with at a skill level that many others actually can't do. And so the combination of charisma and skill at manipulation, it's a very, very risky combination. And somehow we have failed to be immune to it as a community. And I think that that's something that we all really have to get better at dealing with. This one is going to sort of rub some people up the wrong way. But this was an issue, the whole issue about academics and the self-interest of the people who do research is one of the things that was a really large phenomenon, I think, particularly in the systematic reviewing community. I think we've got to the point where it's kind of so normalised that among academics that they're on the search for the next grant, and they want grants, and they want to further the research in the area that they care about, that they're so passionate about, that it's become normal for them to stress that their work isn't being funded, or that they need their work to be funded. And that actually translated into some quite dangerous phenomena, I think, for the community in this time. I think it was reflected sometimes in conclusions, in different ways of looking at the evidence that just concluded, the evidence is really unclear and we need research like this, and this, which is just the research that they want to do. So that whole thing about saying we don't know, but we could know if only you'd fund us to do the kinds of things that we want to do, actually ended up being a really quite major force in that process of casting doubts on different public health interventions and so on. And that was actually really quite harmful at times. And we've focused, now I've put here on this slide a constellation of 4 sets of skills that I think are really, really important for any of us who are going to try and communicate evidence and analyse evidence. And often we think about them as things that that different people do, but I think that they're actually all really quite critical to anybody who's trying to distill the sum of knowledge that we've got on any particular issue. And we focus a lot on the two that I've got there that are horizontal: research and analytical skills and communication skills and literacies. But I think those things on the vertical are utterly critical, and we just don't consider them enough, and we don't talk about them enough. Yes, we talk about some of those issues of the values, like equity in system reviewing, which has been a subject of this meeting too, and that's a really great example of doing it, and explicitly taking these issues into account. But we don't do enough about around the issues of personal integrity and what that means as a researcher and somebody communicating about evidence. And we definitely don't talk anywhere near enough about the cognitive skills that you need to deal with your own biases. Now, this is an old paper, I guess now. I mean, at least it's still in this century, but it's old, 2009. But what they've said, even if the numbers aren't exactly right, it's still really important. They said we have made far more progress in cataloguing cognitive biases than in finding ways to correct them. And when you think about it, that's something that we is really, really quite a critical situation. In systematic reviewing, we've taken the line, I think, that we have methods that deal with that. But the methods that we've got don't actually deal with this critical issue about people's personal biases. Having two people and a third resolve differences it doesn't get around the problem if all of the people have got the same biases that are doing that particular exercise, or if people get together because they've actually got an agenda that they want to use a systematic review to give them, a rhetorical advantage and give their position an advantage. So we're not good. We haven't put the work into understanding author bias, to detecting it, to how can we ameliorate its impact. When we haven't put the effort into understanding what are the skills that we will have to have as individuals, and what do we have to do in applying our work to actually reduce our own personal bias, because it can have such a really big impact. So out of that, I come to two conclusions. One is that we actually have to have a broader approach to risk of bias and consider the issues about personal bias. And it's not enough to have said, put so much effort into the commercial conflicts of interest and not deal with this other issue that we've seen that even some of the greatest experts in the world at bias have been absolute poster children for how to be biased in this pandemic. We have to learn what bias minimization skills are, which ones work, and then how to work on them for ourselves. I mean, there's some in the area of how do you reduce biases for doctors with patients. One of the things that's a really clear message from that is that you have to slow down. And I think that that's a really quite important thing to keep in mind, especially when we're talking a lot about let's speed up systematic review. Let's speed up systematic reviewing. One of the issues about the very definition of confirmation bias is that you give a free pass to the things that you agree with and rip apart the things that you don't. And that's a really critical issue that happens in the tedium of systematic reviewing, that you kind of get this feeling of relief when you get to the trial that you know is good, and then you're on full alert for the trial that you already believe is problematic. But you actually have to put as much effort into each and every single one. we've learned from this thing that you really need to take critics seriously, and you have to really welcome it, as painful as it can be at times, because that's going to be one of the only ways that you're going to get over your own biases. We have to do something that a lot of the people, I think, in our community have been really, really bad at in this pandemic, and that is when you've made a mistake, admit you're wrong and do it properly. That's something that you need to practice out, I think. And underlying it is the final thing that I'd say, that's the always the weak link for everything, and that is that the greatest bias that we have to deal with is our own. I think that's it. Over to you.
Thanks very much, Hilda. That was a really good romp. One of the things that I meant to say when I was going to introduce you was that I really regard you as something of an evidence detective. The kind of intensity and detail that you go into really helps uncover some of the pitfalls and risks, and I think your presentation is really great at that. We've got some nice questions here that I'd be keen to just share with you. I'll just let you know that Sally Crow has said that she'd like to thank you for your independent commentary and research during the COVID pandemic. It sounds to me like she's one of your 24,000 followers on Twitter. And Sally says it's always been a good read, informative and challenging. Jorian Leemans also asks you, should Cochrane not move away from not only including RCTs or other experimental studies just because the fact that the best available evidence for some interventions are delivered by observational studies?
Well, I mean, I think that's an issue that people have been dealing with and moving towards with Cochrane for a really long time. If you take that masks review as an example, it had actually done that. It had used different kinds of evidence, and that's clearly something that you can do within the Cochrane collaboration. There's a lot of support for doing that inside Cochrane reviews. It's just that a lot of people don't do it, and I just think that for some questions, that's actually not that much of a problem, but sometimes it really does become really quite a dangerous thing to have done. And because it pushes you into that zone of saying there's no good evidence, when in fact there really is. And it also pushes us to a thing. I mean, one of the things that I realised I got wrong quite badly early on in this pandemic, or one of the beliefs that I had that the pandemic really shook, was the notion that you always would even want to have a randomised control trial. Because certainly when you looked at it in terms of the pandemic situation, some of the things that early on I was advocating having randomised trials for, as I watched the evidence of during the evidence with actually COVID-19, actually just underscore what we had already learned, or particularly Asian countries had learned and a lot of others had ignored, but it was there in the research that they had done around the first SARS, was just being reinforced. And then I realised, well, in actual fact, in that context, a lot of the randomised trials that people were advocating for, I'd actually have to say now, my position now is I actually would think they were unethical. Sometimes the price of perfect information is just too high. And I think that some of those things that would just increase people's ability to undermine public health support for public health interventions was just plain harmful. So from that point of view, for the question, I'd say absolutely, and perhaps even particularly for public health interventions.
Thank you. Carla Soros-Weiser has said, thank you for this important challenge, Hilda. How fast is fast enough during a global health crisis? Should we be proposing for systematic reviews to inform these large platform trials by providing the evidence base on the decisions about interventions. Could this support immediate updates of living systematic reviews once the results of the platform trial becomes available?
Yeah, I think that those are really important questions and important points. I mean, I think that example that I gave about having relied for convalescent plasma on a systematic review that had a search date in 2013, when it was eminently possible to do a really high quality systematic review, that one that I talk about that was done in July in the Canadian Medical Association Journal. It's an excellent systematic review and had a very, very different result. And I suspect, the people in the recovery trial, they cited that review, and numbers of other people have. But there's nowhere near enough of that, and that's a process that could really help. But to Carla's first question, I think we're at danger of going too fast in this rush to be faster.
Yeah.
I mean, some of the things that I see, I'm like, there are certain things I think to really get your head around evidence that just require thinking time and require time to percolate what you're finding, and you can't compress it, and so there's a real risk that if you do it really, really, really fast, that you get it wrong, and
that's balanced against the risk of not being fast enough sometimes because new stuff's coming out.
Yeah, but I think that there are those kind of processes of going, and you see them sometimes in some health technology assessment agencies where they come in kind of layers. They'll go, here's our first pass. This is the answer that you get this week, and in another few weeks, we're going to come back with, or another couple of months or whatever it is, we're coming back with a more careful, we're not going to stop at the very quick thing that we did first. And I think that's something that we've really got to get better at, of saying, okay, there's a necessity sometimes to come to some opinion about what we know and to act on it, but that comes with really high risk, and we need to encourage that the more careful systematic reviewing process still happens.
Thanks. There's an interesting question here from someone who's anonymous. They ask, another issue with systematic reviews is that they don't take account of other forms of evidence, such as Indigenous ways of knowing. I wonder what others think of these sorts of forms of evidence.
Are you asking me?
Yeah. Is that
right,
something
yeah.
you're talking about?
I think that there's often a failure of imagination as to how to deal with information in different forms. And that is that you can that people from one area can actually derive a real lot of wisdom out of something that somebody else has said, but they have to take the time to understand what that point of view is on its own terms, and not immediately, for example, dismiss it and say, that's just qualitative, or that's, I can see this element of that I absolutely totally disagree with, therefore I dump the whole thing before spending enough time with it to understand, actually, hey, there turns out to be something incredibly important and relevant to how I look at this issue and how I phrase things, what I think's important, what outcomes I look at, what subgroup analyses I think might be important to do, that comes out of that. But it's not the easiest thing in the world to get into a completely different way of thinking and then come back out of it and translate that into a completely different approach to research. But if we had more people that could do it, I think that oftentimes it would make a really quite profound difference. But too often people who are into systematic reviews of trials will kind of dismiss that as bias. I had one time really quite early on in Cochrane where I was really quite upset at the colloquium, which I often was, well, always was, where I walked off the stage after a grilling, and I just thought, I can't stand it. They just think I'm biased on two legs, when I'd be trying to talk about consumer issues and things that were important to patients and so on. And I think that is actually a risk in this community of dismissing other things way too quickly.
Yeah, I think an example that comes to my mind is some guidelines that we were writing on traumatic brain injury, and the research was all focused around people seeing visions of other people. A lot of the Western scientists were trying to find ways of avoiding people seeing visions of people, but for Maori culture, it was something that they treasured and felt supported them through their ill health, and they actually found comfort in it. So I think it's different kinds of interpretations of outcomes. Interesting question. Thank you, Anonymous. Now, we've got another question from Sally Crow. She says, Hilda, if you had to prioritise research into the current ways that we present summary of finding reviews, what would you fund and why?
Oh, what were the options again?
If you had to prioritise research into the current ways that we present summary findings of reviews, what would you fund and why?
Oh God, I would need some time to think about that. Yes, I can't answer that one quickly. I'm sorry. Why don't you answer it, Catherine?
Oh yeah, I don't know. Look, got some other questions.
Good question. I mean,
I've got to come up with something that you can do in 2 minutes. Catherine Jones asks, what do you think evidence-based medicine would look like if there were no financial or non-financial conflicts of interest? That's a good one to end on, isn't it?
Yeah, well, that's not possible. I mean, it's simply not possible. I think for some things it would look absolutely not different at all, and for some issues it would look dramatically different. So I don't think there is this this one thing across the board. I know that we would have different systematic reviews. We'd be looking at different questions, I think, if there were no conflicts of interest, because I think the priorities would be different, and then within them, I think that we would find that we had systematic reviews that were more future-proof. That didn't have to flip their findings 3 years from now. Because they had been much more careful and not so eager to jump to conclusions in a particular direction, that it took a lot of other evidence for a course correction or whatever. So
it's never going to be simple, is it?
No. No, a world without bias is unfortunately impossible.
Irina Zakara Krokov says, it should say about you, Hilda, writer, artist, and meta-researcher. Thank you for a stimulating and thought-provoking presentation. I think that's a really nice way of rounding off this session. Thanks very much, Hilda, for your thought-provoking presentation. Please have a look on the chat site. You'll see a link to Hilda's website where she's got all the references. And please also follow Hilda on Twitter. She's there all the rest of the time. She's not doing her COVID-19 research. It's a really a great way to hear your latest detective work and your insights, Hilda. Thank you for all the work that you do.
Oh, thank you. Sorry for stuffing up the tech.
Oh, well, it's all new to us, I think. I'd like to thank the audience for joining the session. There's now going to be a 15-minute break, and the concurrent sessions will start again at 11 a.m. Anyone in the audience can attend one of the sessions live, and of course they're also recorded, so you can watch them at a later date. So I feel like we should do a down under wave from New Zealand and Australia. I hope you guys are all enjoying the springtime and this really nice event. Thank you for your time today, and Hilda, thanks again for a wonderful presentation. Goodbye, everyone.